Hello, and welcome to this week's PowerPoint. Today, we'll be talking about inclusion, and this leads us to our first question. What do you think inclusion is? You do not have to type up the questions from this PowerPoint and submit them. They are just here to inspire you and have you think about the topic. Where have you seen inclusion in society? Where have you seen it in art? Keep these questions in mind when watching this PowerPoint. Let's begin.
And here's the answer to the first question. Inclusion is the act of taking part in a whole. For example, inclusion is like building a house where multiple people from different departments, like frame builders, electricians, and plumbers, come together to make a complete house. In Kat Mazza's piece, Labor's Sister Sampler, you can see that she made the states look like puzzle pieces, placing them together to make it look like the United States. She uses the element of inclusion to emphasize the meaning of the United States. Including others in the classroom and using inclusion with your peers is very important. Including others is important because it makes the classroom a better learning environment. It can ensure your understanding of the project, and it lets everyone feel welcomed and a part of the team. Now try to imagine a classroom without these elements. It would not be fun. Speaking of not fun, do you remember a time when you weren't included, whether it was a sports game or an out-of-school activity? It probably wasn't a really good feeling, or maybe you were excluded from a school project. Either you were doing all the work or your teammates were not letting you participate. It's another reason why this topic is so important.
The topic of inclusion could be a launchpad into other terms, meaning that the terms listed on the right, relationships, transformation, diversity, complexity, simplicity, unity, variety, exploration, wholeness, coexistence, culture, nationality, region, beliefs or opinions, and faith can make up of the topic of inclusion more specific and can help you narrow down what you're trying to convey or express in your artwork. Throughout the PowerPoint, these terms will be referred as launchpad terms. The topics on the right may be ones you've heard before in other classes, either ones you're taking now or in the past. Why do you think these topics are important? When thinking about this question, try to think of your own personal experience you had with a term listed and try to understand why that experience was important to you. This is a different way of thinking of the question and can make it easier to answer. Okay, so we thought about the why, now let's think of the what. What makes the terms on the right so important? What makes relationships so important? What makes culture so important? Think about these questions when we go over the artists listed in the PowerPoint. Why is the artist we are portraying use inclusion in this way? Miss Garz and Miss Sebasto will be here to help you along the way.
As we saw on the previous slide, inclusion can be incorporated in art in many ways. We can also use inclusion through the elements and principles of art and the postmodern elements of art. You should know these terms already. While we go through the slides, I want you to think of other artists you may know that use inclusion in their art, either artists from the modern day or from the past. As I mentioned in the previous slide, think about why these artists use inclusion in their artwork based off of their information listed about each other. Let's take a look at some of the modern day artists that use inclusion and its launchpad terms. It's okay if you're not familiar with these artists, we are here to learn. If you are really interested about any of the artists that are talked about in this section, you can always email either Ms. Garz or Ms. Sebasto for more information. Now let's get started. Our first artist is Shahzia Sikander. She uses her cultures as her element of inclusion in her artwork. Sikander is an American Pakistani artist, and because of this, she uses both of her cultures in her pieces. Sikander relies on color, symbols, traditions, experience, and stories to create her art. Our second contemporary artist is Kat Mazza. Mazza uses activism as her element of inclusion in her art. She explores the overlapping of textiles, technology, and labor. Mazza explores these overlaps by combining craft and digital media in her artwork. Mazza founded a project called the Micro Revolt. It hosts the freeware called Knit Pro that turns pictures into knit, crochet, needlepoint, and cross-stitch patterns. Here we have 3 pieces by Mazza: Nike Blanket Petition, Electro-Knit Series No. 1, and Stitch for Senate. The Nike Blanket Petition is from 2003 to 2008. International knit and crochet hobbyists participated in the Micro Revolt project, the Nike Blanket Petition. It's a 15-foot wide handmade blanket of the Nike swoosh. Each 4x4 square has a signature for the fair labor policies for Nike garment workers. Over the 5-year period, anti-sweatshop squares were stitched into the quilt, representing people petitioning from over 30 countries. Squares accumulated from Micro Revolt workshops and expedition tours, though many were from global knitting circles by post mail. And on the bottom, we have Stitch for Senate. It was made from 2007 to 2009. Stitch for Senate was a pro-peace initiative of knit hobbyists, making helmet liners for every United States senator in the lead up to the 2008 election. Building on the history of wartime knitting, a practice dating back to the American Revolution, Stitch for Senate used the tradition of political organizing within knitting circles as a space for discussion, skill sharing, and protest. Hobbyists knitted to persuade elected officials to support the troops by bringing them home. Every senator received their own helmet liner mailed on President Obama's inauguration. Out of the 100 senators that were sent, only 11 sent replies. And our last contemporary artist is in fact not an artist at all. His name is Frank Warren, and he is an author, though he claims he is an accidental artist. He created the platform Post Secret for people to share their secrets and worries. For those who participate, they are asked to create their own homemade postcards and mail them to Warren's home address. He picks 20 cards out of thousands to post to the website every Sunday morning. In 2006, Warren helped save the nation's national suicide prevention helpline from being shut down. He asked for help through Post Secret and raised over $1 million for the charity. Not all the postcards shared on the website are for mental illness awareness, but all the postcards allow people to speak freely.
Now let's take a look at some artists from the past who use inclusion in their art. Some of these artists you might recognize, so they would be familiar to you. Once again, if you are really interested in any of the artists mentioned in this section, you can always email either Miss Garz or Miss Sebasto for more information. Let's take a trip in the past. This artist, Harriet Powers, is the first historical artist we will be talking about. She was born a slave in Georgia in 1837 and created quilts after the Emancipation Proclamation was set in place, which freed the slaves in both the North and the South. Powers is known for making only 2 pictorial quilts. First, the Bible quilt, which shows a collection of biblical imagery, like the story of Cain and Abel and the Last Supper. This link placed in the slide is a website you can go to that zooms in on each section of the quilt and explains what biblical story Powers was depicting and what elements she uses in each. The second quilt she made was the pictorial quilt. This quilt uses a modern art principle, juxtaposition, to show another series of biblical stories, but this time she combines them with real-life stories. These quilts are similar to another textile artist that we looked at, Mazza. Even though Mazza and Harriet Powers portray different stories in their piece, they both are based around the topic of inclusion. What elements do the 2 artists use that are the same? What elements do they use that are different? This artist you might be familiar with. Frida Kahlo is a Mexican artist and is well known for her self-portraits. These portraits portray her emotions and her culture. For example, in her piece, Self-Portrait, as a Tuhana, she paints her ex-husband on her forehead. to show that she is thinking of him and misses him very much. Not only did she use inclusion to blend her Mexican heritage in her life, but also how she felt during that time in her life. Can you find any other artists that use inclusion to mix their emotions and self-image, either in modern day or historical? Our last artist is another one that you might be familiar with. Hokusai is a Japanese artist who made around 30,000 prints of artwork in his lifetime. His artwork inspired the Impressionist movement. Artists like Van Gogh and Monet were extremely inspired by his artwork. Can you think of any other artists that Hokusai influenced? Why do you think this type of art was so inspiring? So finally, our projects. Pick one of the 3 projects presented and post your completed project on Google Classroom discussion board so that all the other students can see your work. Our first one is based off Shahzia Sikander. Create an abstract collage illustrating your cultural identity. Use materials like wax paper, a glue stick, colored watercolor, watercolor paper, acrylic paint, and brainstorm what colors or symbols you're going to include in your work to express inclusion. Your next project, Frida Kahlo, this one you have to create a self-portrait that mirrors one of Frida's. Make sure to include cultural elements like animals, patterns, colors, and landscape. And I strongly encourage you to use mostly wet mediums like Kahlo, acrylic, and watercolor. Lastly, Harriet Powers. Create your own pictorial storyline or a comic. Use materials like construction paper, markers or pencils to sketch out your designs, colored pencils or colored pens. Storyline must be a story about your culture. Try not to use words, but instead symbols like Harriet Powers did. Any questions? Don't be afraid to ask. Email either Miss Garz or Miss Sebasto. And that's it. I'll see you next week.